100 years, the First World War and the slaughter on the Western Front continue to fascinate students of history and cast long, dark shadows over the world in which we live. Despite all this interest and attention, popular perceptions of the Western Front remain almost totally dominated by images of futile frontal attacks in the Flanders mud and doomed youth being slaughtered at the whim of uncaring butchers and bunglers who sat in remote chateaus many miles behind the lines. Nothing could be further from the truth. Though the Great War is remembered as one of the costliest conflicts in history, much of it was fought over a relatively small and blood-soaked swath of France and Flanders. It is also striking for the great change and innovation in the art of war. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europeans and Americans were fascinated by speculations about the future. A new genre of fantasy fictions catered to their tastes. Jules Verne and H.G. Wells were the pioneers in creating tales of scientific and technological marvels, of flying machines, life below the oceans, and interplanetary travel. Only a few saw the dark side of the story, a human race that made use of its amazing possibilities by calling forth explosive new powers of destruction.
They were looking ahead to a war that they were pretty sure was going to happen. They didn't know exactly when, they didn't know exactly where, but they were pretty sure that in the not too distant future, there was going to be a war in Europe, one way or the other, and everyone wanted to have the best weaponry, the best equipment possible. And so they began to pour some money into all kinds of military technology.
Looking back, the most remarkable feature of the pre-war international landscape was the accelerating arms race. The German armaments firm Krupp was the largest single business in Europe. Its giant rivals, Skoda, Creusot, and Vickers Maxim, were also enormous. A technological breakthrough would render all existing weapons of that nature obsolete, but risk leaving the opposing country naked before its enemies during the years it required to catch up.
If you know your history of Europe, the European powers were in an arms buildup for most of the early 20th century. They were building up their navies, they were building up their armies.
The outbreak of war saw armies march to battle with the common expectation of a quick resolution, decided by rifles, field guns, cavalry, sweeping maneuvers, and fighting spirit. The traditional, professional, and relatively simple virtues of personal leadership, elan, and skill of arms were expected to carry the day.
One of the things we don't understand is that it was a brutal war, and they tried to maintain as much as they could civility during this brutal war. And it was the last chance, or the last attempt, at trying to keep your humanity, keep your sanity, and keep your graciousness and conduct as a gentleman. It was very serious to them. And it was an attempt that the technology of the time, the Maschinengewehr, the Maxim gun, the Parabellum, all of the wonderful machines of war that were developed far exceeded the tactics. At the beginning of the war, they all marched very close-knit together until they watched what a machine gun would do.
4 years later, strategy, tactics, and the material of war had been altered almost beyond recognition, and society itself had changed with them. Campaigns could now be decided by demography, citizen soldiers, technology, and industrial effort. Battles by a combination of rapid, long-range bombardments, new small unit tactics, automatic weapons, concrete, and tanks. Individual will to succeed, battlecraft, the empty battlefield, and the ability to accept casualties had changed the very idea of war. The physical conditions of the fighting in the First World War aroused both fascination and disbelief. How was it that the individual soldier put up with the cold, the wet, the dirt, the noise, the frequent death of comrades, the constant danger, and the apparent inevitability, sooner or later, of personal extinction, perhaps cleanly by a bullet in the open, but much more probably by multiple wounding from a shell, by suffocation in a trench cave-in, by shock and loss of blood, or simple infection.
We took a machine gun one time with a group of friends of mine who owned an MG08-15, which is a portable machine gun. We set it up, we saw trees. They were about 6 inches in diameter, saplings. We wondered, we said, what would it be like to live fire one of these? So we put a belt in it, boom, 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 and the trees fell. So when you realize and you look at that technology and you see what it did, you say, my God.
And how was it that the extraordinary trench environment in which the millions suffered this agony came into being in the first place? To the European armies of the period, trench warfare was anathema. All subscribed with greater or lesser fervency to a doctrine of war which laid its emphasis upon mobility and maneuver, and upon the pursuit of a swift decision. It took no more than a month for years of training to fall apart. At the dawn of the 20th century, another war between the great powers was much talked about. Yet, the nature of a European war, as opposed to a colonial venture, was little understood. What was known were the many swift forays by superior forces against distant, feeble foes, machine guns against spears, massive naval firepower against antique guns. These engagements met with quick, easy victory for the Europeans. However frightening those conflicts could be for those who took part in them, the politicians at home had little sense of the horror of these new weapons. Why should war in Europe be feared? In the spring of 1914, war was a gay, droll affair. Armies marched with flags waving in the breeze, troops in brightly colored uniforms with big shiny buttons. That was about to change. The route which led the major powers of Europe to war in 1914 was long and tortuous, with many factors driving them to armed conflict. Perhaps the most important and obvious was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. That limited confrontation had seen the humiliating defeat of France and the unification of the German states under Prussian leadership. The sudden emergence of the German Empire, which, as part of the spoils of victory, took the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine from France, brought about a fundamental shift in the European balance of power. Germany's accelerated progress towards economic and military ascendancy only intensified the anxieties of her neighbors. In 1913, Germany was second only to America as the most powerful industrial nation in the world. For the better part of 2 decades, between 1871 and 1890, the new European status quo was not seriously challenged, thanks to the diplomatic dexterity and deviousness of Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor who kept France isolated. When Bismarck left office in 1890, it was not long before a fresh series of unpredictable currents began to erode the foundation of his carefully constructed continental system. A rapid deterioration in Russo-German relations and a rapprochement between Republican France and Tsarist Russia compelled Germany to strengthen her existing links with the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy. This alliance ensured that she possessed an ally to the east. Germany would pay a heavy price for a policy that tied her more closely to a dilapidated empire that was itself finding it increasingly difficult to curb the nationalist aspirations of its diverse population. The potentially explosive situation in the Balkans was made more dangerous by the decline of Turkish influence. In seeking to exploit such opportunities, Austria and Russia each embarked upon a course which could only end in confrontation. The rise of Serbia added yet another hazardous element to an unstable regional mixture. Serbia had been infuriated by Austria's annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908. In turn, Serbia gained influence and territory as a result of the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, giving Austria mounting cause for irritation. With the departure of Bismarck, the belligerent and erratic Wilhelm II, who had become Kaiser in 1888, soon spurred Germany to follow a more aggressive path in international relationships. France, already determined to avenge the disaster of 1870 and win back her lost provinces, was further alarmed by Germany's developing industrial and military muscle. Russia, too, had grounds for concern about an Austro-German alliance that not only threw an ominous shadow across her western frontier, but was likely to counteract Russian interests in the Balkans. The first and probably the most significant crack in the edifice erected by Bismarckian diplomacy came in 1892, the removal of its cornerstone, the isolation of France. That year, Russia and France concluded a military agreement, reinforced by additional talks in 1893 and 1894, under which each promised to come to the other's aid if either was attacked by Germany. This change from Bismarck's realpolitik to the Weltpolitik of Kaiser Wilhelm II ultimately forced Britain to review her relations with the other leading players on the European and world stages. Britain was relatively friendly with Germany for much of the last quarter of the 19th century, not the least because Queen Victoria's eldest daughter was married to the German Crown Prince Frederick, who succeeded to the imperial throne in March 1888. When Frederick died from cancer after reigning for barely 3 months, the accession of his estranged son, Wilhelm II, heralded fresh competition with Britain for colonies and overseas markets. The new Kaiser sought world power status for Germany. His first public words as Kaiser were not to the public, but were addressed to the army.
We belong to each other, I and the army. We were born for each other and will indissolubly cleave to each other. I promise ever to bear in mind that from the world above, the eyes of my forefathers look down on me, and that I shall one day have to stand accountable to them for the glory and honor of the army.